evening. This is Justin Ford for From the Front Line. Tonight we will be dealing with the topic, what is behind the slaughter in Syria? Another stable country betrayed? In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, Syria is in the news once again. We are hearing and seeing very disturbing images of widespread massacres of unarmed people. And before we get into what is happening and why, can you please give us some background so that the audience can understand where Syria is and what Syria is?
Yes, so Syria is officially the Syrian Arab Republic. It's a country in West Asia. It's bordering the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. So immediately to the west, it's got the Mediterranean Sea. Turkey's immediately to the north. Iraq is to the east and the southeast. Jordan is to the south. And Israel and Lebanon is to the southwest. Syria is a republic, and it's under a so-called transitional government, which comprises about 14 different governorates, as they call it, or provinces. Damascus is the capital city, and it's the largest city. Damascus, by the way, is also the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world today. And of course, Damascus is famous in the Bible as being where Saul of Tarsus was on the road to Damascus when he was converted. And then Antioch, which is where believers were first called Christians, as we read in the book of Acts. That's Antioch is in what today is called Syria. 6% of the population of Syria are Christians. In fact, after the betrayal and the fall of Iraq, Syria had the largest number of Christians in the Middle East in a Muslim country. There's a bit more in Egypt, but in Asia, the largest number of Christians in a Muslim country, or largest percentage, is in Syria. So the Syrian Christians were very much overrepresented in the army. A large amount of President Assad's army and police came from the Christians because they knew the only thing standing between them and being beheaded by ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Al-Nusra Front was the secular state of President Assad that tried to protect Christians and other minorities, and especially other religions in Syria. And so historically, Syria, the name is referred to a wider region, but the modern state encompasses the sites of several ancient kingdoms and empires, and Damascus was the capital for the Umayyad Caliphate. So at one stage, Damascus was the capital city for Islam's caliphate worldwide. And later it became the provincial capital under the Mamluk Sultanate, and then they were conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and then it just became a provincial capital. After the First World War, when Turkey was defeated, it became a French mandate, so the Versailles Treaty handed over Syria to the French to run, which lasted just until the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, Syria became a founder member of the United Nations, and the French troops withdrew the next year. And so Syria's official independence is based in 1946. And post-independence has been tumultuous, to put it nicely. Multiple coup attempts between 1949 and 1971, but then they got stabilized under the Assad family and government. So Hasif al-Assad, who is the father of the President Bashir al-Assad, he stabilized the country and saw that Syria, because Syria is home to a vast amount of diverse ethnic and religious groups. Arabs are the largest ethnic group, and Sunni Muslims are the largest religious group, but they're Christians, they're Jews, there are a whole lot of different other sects and groupings, and there are Kurds, there's many groups in Syria. So the Syrian government under Assad, both his father Hafiz al-Assad and Bashir Assad, they were very tolerant of diversities, and they protected the minorities. And that's why they got so much support from the minorities and the Christians.
So what actually is happening in Syria, or has been happening, and why is there so much violence in this country?
So there have been massacres of Christians and of the Alawite minority tribes in the far north of the country, which is the part of the country where it's on the Mediterranean and it's very close to Turkey. So in the far north, these people have been targeted, the Alawite people, who are a kind of sect of Islam, but they were a more tolerant group and they are considered heretics by the average Sunni Muslims. But that was the tribal and religious base for the President Assad government. And that's also a stronghold for Christianity. There are many Christians in the area, and they've been targeted for massacres. There's been many shocking videos circulating on social media of obviously unarmed people, men, women, and children, just being shot in the head, shot in the back, shot while lying on the ground, being abused, beaten with rifle butts. I mean, it's actually quite horrific. And the reason why there's so much violence in the country, well, you just have to look back to the Arab Spring of 2011. Syria has been embroiled in a multi-sided, complex civil war since the Arab Spring was launched. And it led to a massive refugee crisis because you had so many different groups being involved and 12 foreign countries supporting them, including the United States, mind you, supporting the terrorists, the revolutionaries, the jihadists, the radicals and extremists. So well more than 6 million refugees were displaced and fled the country. And they are part of the human wave tsunami who poured into Europe. And so this demographic time bomb, as some people call it, of millions of Arabs from the Middle East and from North Africa fleeing into Europe. Part of the spring for this was Syria. In fact, for a long time, people spoke about the refugee crisis, a Syrian refugee crisis, although the Syrians are by no means the only ones fleeing into Europe or moving there. And there are millions in Germany and Sweden and all over Europe right now who fled there because of this war. I've met some Syrians as far afield as Belgium and got first-hand accounts from them of what was going on. But not only people fleeing the fighting have gone into Europe with these refugees. In some cases, it's been documented and proven, some of the mass murdering terrorists have come in with these refugees. And there are pictures which have been proven by the Syrian Secret Service who scoured the social media and found that have a picture of a terrorist who's got someone's head in their one hand and his AK-47 another. And then you can see the same person now running some kind of delicatessen or whatever in Netherlands and things like this. So just extraordinary. There's obviously a lot of terrorists have used the refugee crisis to infiltrate Europe, and maybe they're sleeper agents who will pop out later. But that's one of the disturbing things. Millions of people have fled. And so you had groups like ISIS, the Islamic State, and al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, supported by different groups, in some cases supported by Turkey, other cases by America and Iran. But they have been murdering people in Syria for so long. It's estimated that over 600,000 people have died from the Syrian civil war, which is not so much a civil war because many of the so-called Syrians involved in the civil war are not Syrians. They have come from all over the world. There's even volunteers from America and from Britain, Muslims who are born in Britain and Muslims born in America, who have come and are fighting there. So you've got Saudi Arabians, you've got Iranians, you've got such a wide variety of foreigners fighting, people from France, in the civil war. So to call this civil war is not even accurate. It's a multi-faceted so-called civil war. But Syria has been targeted by many different regimes from around the world to be toppled. And it was an anomaly in the Middle East because it was a moderate secular government which respected religious freedom and protected religious and ethnic minorities. And obviously we've been seeing now that the replacement is far, far worse. The so-called liberators are much more oppressive, much more violent, much more intolerant, a far greater threat than the so-called authoritarian regime that was there before that brought stability to the country and a certain level of religious freedom and tolerance. So right now, you've got groups like the Syrian Interim Government, the Syrian Salvation Government, the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, all involved in, they were involved in the campaign to overthrow President Assad's stable rule in the country, and they succeeded towards the end of last year, 2024. There were a series of offensives which led to the capture of Damascus, the capital, and the fall of President Assad's regime, and he was advised by the Russians to flee. They flew him out to Moscow, where he has sought asylum and been granted asylum. So 600,000 people dead, massive refugee crisis. They say that more than 7.6 million people have been internally displaced by the looting, burning, scorched earth, and more than 5 million refugees overseas registered by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But they think it's more like 7 million refugees are outside the country. Most of them, it seems, in Europe. So it's pretty catastrophic. You're talking about 90% of the population are living in what they call poverty and 80% facing food insecurity. This was a prosperous, productive, self-supporting country that didn't need any foreign aid before. But because of the war, the terrorism, actually is a better word, because it's not really a war when you're killing civilians, the Syrian country's been undermined. But this, you could say it all started with the Arab Spring, which was a deliberately orchestrated regime change campaign to undermine these stable countries in the Middle East and bring about a demographic time bomb of refugees fleeing into Europe, and to replace a government that was allied with Russia and which was opposed to the globalists. I think Stephen Goodson would add they also, by sheer coincidence, didn't have a Rothschild-controlled bank or usury, so that they didn't have a state bank controlled by the Rothschild family and the usury crowd. So there could be an economic motive behind the destabilizing of this once very stable and prosperous country in the Middle East.
Where did all these revolutionary/terrorist groups come from? How were they supported?
Well, sorry to say that you've got to take this all the way back to Obama. And President Obama launched the CIA-backed Operation Timber Sycamore back in 2012, 2013. Barack Hussein Obama, as American president, secretly authorized the CIA to begin arming, funding, and training of Syria's groups. And this included Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra Front and, of course, ISIS. In fact, an American chief of staff had to testify to U.S. Congress, yes, we started, meaning America started ISIS. You know, remember, ISIS been beheading Christians, blowing up national monuments like the Tomb of David and I should say the Tomb of Daniel and the Tomb of Jonah and so on, blowing up mosques, churches, monuments. ISIS, very radical. They've been beheading hordes of Christians. And the American government had to admit, even Vice President Joe Biden, as he was then under Obama, yes, we started ISIS, but it was for a good cause. It was to overthrow the government of Assad in Syria. And yes, they've gotten a bit out of control, but, they're our people. So not only has the United States government support them, but they were getting support from Britain. U.S. Special Forces even went into Syria to occupy, for example, the Konoko oil fields, and they fought with Kurdish forces, and they fought against ISIS and the Russian Wagner group. So it's been a bit of a free-for-all. It's an international war, but it was called a civil war.
So what is going on in Syria today?
Well, the end result of all this Western involvement, you will probably recall Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, Obama, Biden, even Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain saying, Assad must go. It's time for Assad to step aside, for Assad to be overthrown. And they wanted these revolutionaries to win. And as somebody who's seen this pattern before, betraying Rhodesia, handing over to the communist terrorists of Zimbabwe, Mugabe's thugs, or seeing the betrayal of the Shah of Iran, and betraying Iran, which was a peaceful, pro-Western, stable country, into the hands of the Ayatollah crazies. And we've seen this pattern before. Vietnam, 1975, and Ukraine, 2014. The liberators turn out to just be oppressors, and the government that was meant to be authoritarian and bad turns out to be the golden age for the people. And they think, well, the liberators turned out to be vastly worse than anything we were meant to be getting freed from. And so it's a nightmare, jumping out of the frying pan into the fire and that sort of thing. So, yes, what's going on in Syria today is the inevitable consequences of supporting terrorists and destabilizing and overthrowing a stable government that was standing for religious freedom. Syria is experiencing the worst bloodshed since the civil war began. So this is all part of the victory, the fall of President Bashar al-Assad 3 months ago. And now we've seen since the 6th of March, these Sunni fighters, they're basically the old terrorists. So what they call the security forces now, you've got to remember, are the terrorists of just a few days ago. And they say that they've been restoring order, neutralizing the enemy, the remnants of the Assad government, And what they mean by neutralizing must mean murdering, because what we're seeing is piles of bodies, lines of bodies in the streets, all unarmed, obviously. And these so-called security forces, just the previous terrorists, are running around shooting people and filming it with their body cams and posting on the internet pictures of them riding on the backs of some of these people, especially the Alawite people who were the support base in many ways for President Assad's previous government, and beating people and forcing people to walk around on their hands and knees on all fours, barking like dogs, and then hitting them with rifle butts and shooting them. And men, women, children, all ages, grey-haired people and so on. Absolutely disgusting. And so eyewitnesses are describing streets strewn with bodies, rows of burned-out homes. Sometimes they've come trying to search for people who they say used to serve in the previous government, in other words, the previous security forces, and then when they can't find them, just burning the house down in case they're hiding somewhere. They've been reported to have burnt down homes that actually have children in them, even babies, and according to some of the reports, there's well over 1,000 killed. Others are speaking about thousands. But just looking at the hundreds that you can see on the body cam pictures taken by the so-called security forces, the terrorists, they've killed hundreds of people already. You can just see piles of bodies and lines of bodies, and just cold-blooded mass murder. And this has pitted the Islamicist-led new government forces against the previous security personnel and their families and their neighbors in the north of the country, where the Alawite minority are. And that's a version of Islam. And the Alawite civilians, whom the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports are being killed in reprisals. I don't know what reprisals there could be, except for the fact that the security forces, so-called, were going to arrest the previous security forces or personnel who had served as civil servants in the previous government. And then there was some self-defense attempting to prevent these people from being, obviously, they expect to be mistreated and shot out of hand, which is exactly what happened. So they weren't wrong. And it's chaos. Basically what you're seeing is massacres and slaughter in Syria.
But wasn't there great rejoicing and celebration when President Assad's government was overthrown? Weren't we assured that peace had now returned to Syria?
Yes, and this is the pattern. We've seen it so often. And, for example, we've seen USAID gave $15 billion for regime change in Syria over a 10-year period. $15 billion. The British government this year, we're talking about this British Foreign Minister David Lammy, he gave 50 million British pounds to Syria for inclusion. Well, I don't know how shooting the Christian and Alawite minorities fits into inclusion, unless they're considering including them all in a mass grave. But you've got the German government gave 50 million euro, and that's this German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, and she went to hand this over. There were so many Western governments, the British, the American, the French, of course we're talking about the Biden regime, were singing the praises of this HRT terrorist group because the interim president, Hammond al-Shara, and he's got more than one name, because the Americans used to have a massive bounty on his head, a $10 million bounty on the head of the HTS leader who grew out of Al-Qaeda, mind you, Hammond al-Shara, but he's also known as al-Jalani. And the Americans had to redesignate HTS from being a foreign terrorist organization, and they took down that designation, and they removed the $10 million bounty on the head of this HTS leader, Hammond al-Shara, who's now the so-called interim president. Of course, he hasn't been elected. It's amazing how you can go from being a terrorist to being a president in a matter of minutes. And these European countries that were just singing the praises of this new government, and, you know, Syria's saved, peace has come to Syria, and now we've got a future of tolerance and inclusion and diversity and all this. And where are these people now? They have been so quick to celebrate the fall of a stable government that didn't accept their globalism and which didn't have a Rothschild bank, mind you, which might have something to do with this, you know, just by sheer coincidence, perhaps. So it's extraordinary. Where are these people? They are absolutely falling over themselves to welcome this new government and saying that, the era of authoritarian oppression by the al-Assad government is now over. I think many people are now wishing that Assad was back, but a bit late now. One can only hope that Russia will be able to finish the war in Ukraine quick enough that they can turn some attention and to bring some order back to Syria. I don't know if they regard it too far gone, but something needs to be done to save the people of Syria, because I don't know how many Christians or religious minorities are going to be surviving the next few months. At this moment, you've got all the people who sang the praises of this new era of peace. It reminds us of those who were celebrating America's withdrawal from South Vietnam in 1975, and then so silent when millions of Vietnamese end up in concentration camps or mass graves, or as happened in Cambodia, a third of the total population was slaughtered under the Khmer Rouge, or the Matabele who were being thrown down mine shafts and massacred in Zimbabwe after they removed Rhodesia. And all these terrible consequences. This is a pattern. Remember how it was said that it is dangerous to be America's enemy and it is fatal to be America's friend. And it's better to be America's enemy than America's friend, because if you're America's enemy, you'll probably be bought, but if you're America's friend, you'll certainly be sold. And that certainly was true for Obama and Clinton. It was true for Biden. It was true back in Jimmy Carter's era too. So, yes, the situation is pretty drastic, and I think that the supporters who worked for this regime change are awfully silent right now.
Yeah, so, we didn't see, we haven't seen any fruit of the public assurances that the new administration would respect religious minorities and freedoms.
Far from it. And indeed, what happened to all the billions given by USAID for regime change, which I believe USAID funded the overthrow of 8 governments and I don't know how many assassinations, but the USAID, of course, helped fund the whole Arab Spring, which started this disastrous, catastrophic toppling of stable governments in the Middle East in the name of democracy and freedom, which never followed, mind you. So, and as for what Britain and Germany and France have been pouring into this hideous government, shame on them all. Absolutely disgusting and treacherous. Interestingly, the interim president, Hammond al-Sharia, has reacted by blaming the victims of threatening his government. So the ones who being massacred and getting bullets in the back of the head, they are the ones to blame for this. Obviously, his government of ex-terrorists are completely innocent of all wrongdoing. And this is a Sunni-led Islamicist government, which is a coalition of different terrorist groups, basically. And they are saying that they're crushing and eliminating remnants of the previous Assad government. I don't know where that fits in with respecting religious minorities, respecting freedoms and human rights and all of the other eyewash that they've been throwing at people.
Back in 2011, when the war began, it was part of the Arab Spring movement, which was celebrated and supported by many governments in the West, as you've alluded to. At the time, you warned that this was not a positive movement to be celebrated or supported, but an anti-Christian movement that would result in an increase of persecution of Christians. Time seems to have vindicated your position. Can you please give us some insights as to what the Arab Spring movement really was?
Yes, indeed. Time has vindicated this position, although at the time I was being shouted down as not recognizing how wonderful this was, and this is the flowering of democracy in the Middle East. And in fact, they were trumpeting worldwide, TV, radio, newspapers, governments were trumpeting the flowering of democracy in North Africa and the Middle East. Pluralism, freedom and tolerance, and a new era of democratic freedom is dawning. Well, I don't think the people on the ground see it that way, considering how many Christians got beheaded, how many churches got burned and bombed, and the catastrophic damage that's been done. You think Syria was once one of the most stable, peaceful, productive countries in the Middle East, and now it's a byword for total destruction. Now, the radical Islamicists who've replaced the previously moderate governments, it seems the enthusiasm for the Arab Spring has waned, and now a seemingly never-ending stream of stubborn reality has shaken enthusiastic praise singers of the Arab Spring. Tunisia used to be recognized as the most tolerant of all Muslim states in the Middle East. But Egypt today published a graphic footage of a young convert to Christianity being beheaded while the Islamic militants recited the Quran and chanted Islamic slogans and curses in Arabic. And the popular support for murdering Arabs who convert to Christianity bodes ill for the so-called Arab Spring. And car bombs, assassinations, mob attacks on Coptic churches in Egypt followed the fall of Mubarak, because Mubarak, the authoritarian leader of Egypt, as they called him, he had soldiers posted outside every church in the country to protect Christians from the radical Islamicist elements. And when that stable government was overthrown and the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, then suddenly they were attacking churches all over the country. In one weekend, over 70 churches and even the Bible study shop was burned out in arson attacks. Some churches had stood for over 1,000 years. And we got pictures of our friends worshipping in burned out wrecks of what were churches that were stable for over a millennium. And the BBC head of news, Helen Bowden, admitted her journalists did get carried away with events and they produced overexcited reports. No jokes. She told the BBC Trust report that in Libya, her reporters were embedded with the rebels and they may have failed to explore both sides of the story properly. You think? BBC Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen was amongst those criticised in the study and found that excitement infected the reporting, which was described as too emotive and veering into opinion. I think often what they call news is nothing but views, actually. And so this investigation into how the BBC got it so wrong on the Arab Spring, the report also raised concerns about how the BBC used footage filmed on mobile phones and other unverifiable user-generated content. And it noted the BBC failed to warn its viewers about the questionable authenticity of such footage in most cases. Well, in fact, we now know that a lot of the videos of atrocities that these stable secular governments were being accused of was actually false flag material generated by the USAID, who was orchestrating, directing and funding the whole Arab Spring anyway. So there's hordes of false flags where they generate an atrocity image and then they claim that this is responsible for whoever they're targeting, in this case the Egyptian government of Mubarak and so on. And so Ms. Bowden said, in the conflict in Egypt in the beginning, we might have sounded overexcited. You can take on the color of who you're with. And I had to say, just be careful about your tone. In Libya too, where we were essentially embedded with the rebels, meaning the jihadist terrorists, we might have sounded overexcited. You have to be grateful if you can't get to the other side of the story. And the Daily Mail in 2012 reported our coverage of the Arab Spring was overexcited. And Fox News later commented that none of the pundits, although they were proven to be consistently wrong about the Arab Spring, were ever held accountable for the disastrous movement they had promoted. And back in February 2011, I wrote an article for Joy magazine, widely circulated, called What is Happening in the Middle East? And in that article, I warned radical groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood are attempting to exploit the instability and to hijack the popular revolution, to turn Tunisia from a mostly secular and tolerant state into a radical Islamicist regime. And I warned in the same article, an Islamicist takeover in Egypt would be a massive crisis because the country has so much influence in the peace process with the State of Israel. Egypt is America's key regional ally and was the first Arab state to make peace with Israel and start open trade and so on. And the vital Suez Canal is controlled by Egypt. And the popular uprising in Egypt is being described by the Iranians as an Islamic awakening, not a democratic Arab Spring or so on, but an Islamic awakening, which could lead to the establishment of an Islamicist Middle East led by Iran, dedicated to exterminating the State of Israel. And I might add, exterminating Christians as well. Along with this tidal wave of popular Islamic fanaticism on the ground, on the streets, came a sharp increase of violent persecution of Christian communities. Many hundreds of Christians were murdered in violent attacks on churches, and especially in Iraq and Egypt. Tens of thousands of Christians then packed up and fled the region. Now, bear in mind, these are Christians related to families that had stayed in the Middle East for over a millennium under Islamic rule. but to flee now. In 2010, I was at a major missions conference, the Cape Town 2010, which is also known as Lausanne 3. And we noted that there were 15 million Christians in the Middle East in 2010. That's the lowest number of Christians in any region of the world. But the trouble is that in the next 5 years, we lost 5 million Christians out of the Middle East, either fled or were murdered. And so this is like a genocide, because there were 1.6 million Christians in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's protection. He had a lot of religious toleration, so much so that Saddam Hussein, the head of Iraq, had all of his bodyguards and all of his cooks and caterers were Christians, because Christians don't assassinate people. And he knew that he could trust them to keep him safe, because their religious freedom, their lives itself, depended on his tolerant policy towards Christians. And so Christians in Iraq were doing quite well. But then, of course, the Americans invaded, destroyed everything, and opened up the country to democracy. And every time democracy is opened up in the Middle East, the result is radical Islamicist regimes get elected. And this has been seen one after the other, that once America brings democracy to these countries, instead of tolerance and protection of religious minorities, you suddenly get radical persecution. And just to give an example here, as I warned already back in 2012, that surveys and opinion polls in Egypt have revealed 59% of Egyptians back Islamicists. 50% of Egyptians supported the radical Hamas terrorist group. 30% of Egyptians supported the even more radical and violent Hezbollah. And 20% of Egyptians expressed support for the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, which has now seized power in Syria, mind you. And so the proposed solution by Western liberals to virtually every problem worldwide, the ballot box, democracy, is not going to work in the Middle East. After the American military succeeded in toppling Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in Iraq, they made possible the first democratic elections in that country. The result was more radical Islamists in power, far more severe persecution of Christians than had ever been experienced before, and massacres, annihilation, effectively the genocide of Christians in Iraq. They've gone from 1.6 million Christians under Saddam Hussein to less than 100,000 Christians left in Iraq today. That is catastrophic. You can't send in enough missionaries to make up for having lost over 1 million Christian families that had been embedded in the country, knew the language and culture for the last millennium. This is absolutely catastrophic. So, as I noted back in 2012, the religion of Islam does not seem to be at all comfortable with the concept of freedom. In fact, the religion of Islam is diametrically opposed to the Western world's concept of freedom. The Islam idea of freedom bears no resemblance to the Western understanding of freedom. What Islam defines as freedom, Westerners call slavery. In fact, that's exactly what Islamic scholars are defining freedom as, that you're a slave of Allah. And Ibn Arabi, a noted Islamic scholar, said freedom is being perfect slavery to Allah. So the Muslim definition of freedom is submission and subjection to Sharia law, which I don't think many people think of as the kind of freedom they'd want to live under. So one article in the Middle East pointed out that a Pew opinion poll found 84% of Egyptians favored the death penalty for what they call apostates. In other words, a Muslim who chooses to leave Islam and become a Christian or something else. 74% of Egyptians favored strict enforcement of Sharia law, cutting off hands and feet and beheadings and that sort of thing. 67% of Egyptians favored a caliphate, a military dictatorship to force all Muslims to live under Sharia law. So much for democracy. Islam doesn't recognize any other religion as valid. And what we in the West understand as freedom of religion, to Muslims means freedom for Muslims only. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which was poised to hijack this popular revolution of the Arab Spring in Egypt, they had been responsible for the brutal public assassination of President Anwar Sadat back in 1981, and the birth of Hamas and Hezbollah and the birth of Al-Qaeda. These were terrorist groups. And so for Western leaders like Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to say the Muslim Brotherhood is a force for peace and moderation in the Middle East, despite their bloody track record, was incredible. It's hard to believe anyone could be that stupid. But that's what Hillary Clinton said. And that's what her State Department worked for. the toppling of these stable governments that respected and protected Christians, and the replacement with mass murdering anti-Christian savages and terrorists.
Yeah, this is quite disturbing in light of what you mentioned about the funding of the Arab Spring coming through organizations like the USID and with the CIA and the US State Department involved as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, it's now been proven USAID put $10 billion into the regime change in Syria, so they can really pat themselves on the back. They've at last succeeded. Remember, USAID put $6 billion into regime change in Ukraine in 2014, which led to this disastrous war we've just had. But they've put billions into Arab Spring and 15 billion over a 10-year period in Syria for regime change. So this is the result of what the CIA, the State Department, USAID, and I'm sorry to say the EU have been funding. Britain, France, Germany have all had a hand in this, bringing this government to power. 14 different governments were involved in trying to bring down the Assad regime, and the only ones that ever tried to help them was Russia. Funny when you find Russia on the right side for a change. But those who understand Islam and who understand the Middle East must understand that democracy will bring change, but it'll be in the form of the worst nightmare. Democracy in the Middle East would bring an Islamicist crescent stretching from Pakistan in the east to Morocco in the west, a pan-Arabian caliphate, where Islamist would no longer be just shorthand for terrorist, but Islamist would be official government policy, even in the capitals such as Cairo and now Damascus. So it is catastrophic and to especially bear in mind that taxpayers in Europe and America funded this, whether they knew it or approved of it or not.
Where can listeners learn more about Islam and the Middle East, Dr. Hammond?
Well, I wrote the book Slavery, Terrorism and Islam, which got such a violent reaction. I got death threat fatwa for it, that I produced a second edition. It was double the size. Then a third edition, it was 3 times the size. And our Slavery, Terrorism, Islam has been continuously in demand and often out of print, but we've still got some copies. Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, available also as prints on demand and ebooks worldwide. But you can contact Christian Liberty Books, admin@christianlibertybooks.co.za, and obtain the Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, or you can go onto our Frontline Mission SA.org website and see the books available. We've even got stocks pre-positioned in North America. Because of the great demand for Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, we actually produced this book at a printer in America too, so that we didn't have to pay for the transportation costs to getting across the Atlantic. So while we've got supplies in Cape Town, we also have supplies pre-positioned up in North America, and people can order from there, or go on our website and get the links to the ebook or the print on demand. Slavery, Terrorism and Islam, the historical roots and the contemporary threat. And that includes understanding about Islam and how to evangelize Muslims too. It's got the history, it's got the caliphate, it's got jihad and all the understanding of how Muhammad built up the movements in the first place, and the modern movements of Islam that grew out of the fall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So I think go onto our website, frontlinemissionsa.org or christianlibertybooks.co.za, and you'll find Slavery, Terrorism and Islam.
And what can we practically do to help resolve this unacceptable situation in the Middle East? And how can we help persecuted Christians caught up in this tragedy?
Well, we must remember the persecuted, and Christians are being murdered right now in Syria. They're being targeted for being Christians. Churches are being targeted. Christians are being murdered. We need to stand for the persecuted. We need to pray for them. We need intercession. We need evangelism. We need assistance. And there are missions to the persecuted church that one needs to support. I think, as the scripture says, remember the persecuted as if chained with them. And we remember we are one body in the church, and we should stand for those who are suffering. We should also be working on a long-term solution of evangelizing our enemies. I've seen Muslims come to Christ. I've led Muslims to Christ. I've seen an entire battalion of Muslims in Sudan come over the border and spoken to the commander. They came over and said, we want to become Christians. We want to fight for the South. They were so repelled and disgusted by the extreme intolerance and violence of the al-Bashir government in Sudan that they literally wanted to come to the South, and they were so attracted and impressed by the courage of the Christians resisting radical Islam in Sudan. So Muslims do come to Christ. Even this year, I've had debates in mosques, gone to Muslim strongholds, evangelized Muslims on the streets near Cape Town at what they call Boerkaap. There is no doubt that Muslims are interested in the gospel. They're fascinated by Jesus. They're responsive to Jesus film, even more to the Passion of the Christ film. We put gospels in the hands, the Injil of Jesus, and they are responsive. And I think if people could learn more about Islam and learn how to evangelize Muslims, that would be a long-term solution. David was a conqueror. He killed Goliath. But the Lord Jesus, more than a conqueror, he took Saul the apostle, the persecutor of the church, and he turned him into Paul the apostle, the evangelist of the church. So he went from being a persecutor to being an evangelist. And this is the hope. When we can win enemies, win Muslim or communist jihadists and enemies, terrorists to the Lord, we need to do more to evangelize our enemies. I recommend that any listeners visit our www.frontlinemissionsa.org website, and that's Frontline Mission SA, short for South Africa.org, and you will see we've got projects like Evangelize Our Enemies, and these are good projects which I think is far more productive than sending in the Marines, rather send in the missionaries. Instead of bombing them, how about bombarding them with prayer and with Bibles? And I believe that that is a long-term solution. We need to get serious about fulfilling the Great Commission, winning the Middle East back to, make the Middle East Christian again. Remember, this is the heartland of the church. The church developed in Syria, places like Damascus and Antioch. So bringing Syria back to its Christian roots would be a long-term solution. You're not going to get religious tolerance and freedom and respect for minorities without Christianity. We need to evangelize these areas, and I think that's a long-term solution, because what we've seen now is the meddling of these politicians and governments around the world, wrecking stable governments. They did it to Iran, they did it to Rhodesia, they're doing it in Syria right now. This is the inevitable result of liberal, woke, LGBTQ, CRT policies, and this insane policy of the West of toppling stable governments and bringing in radical terrorists, and they think that that's going to be some kind of improvement. Well, I think the news headlines of what's going on in Syria right now is a rebuke to all those leftists. The compassions of the wicked are cruel, and their policies are counterproductive consistently. Someone's got to recognize this pattern.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hammond, for putting the tragic situation in Syria into perspective. We pray for our co-believers in Syria. In closing, I'd like to read from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 to 24. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are clever in their own eyes and clever in their own sight, but deny justice to the innocent. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Front Line. God bless and good night.